Hello and welcome to a video about a machine that we saw quite a while ago. Many moons ago I built this. Is my kind of ultimate Windows XP gaming machine. It was in a glass case with all sorts of bling and lights and pretty tasteless stuff really, but now I'm going to move it all into an older case, basically just to make it easier to use, because you kind of got to be painful using USB optical drives and having no floppy and that kind of thing. So this isn't really what the video is about, but we're going to move it into this case anyway. The video is actually about thermoelectric cooling. So what we're going to do is move this machine into the new case, and then we're going to try and cool it with an alternative method using a Peltier thermoelectric cooler. Not going to go into too much detail about the components. You can check out that other video. I'll put a link below if you want to watch it. But the motherboard here is from Asus. It's a P5N-E SLI board based around NVIDIA's 650i chipset. It's an LGA 775 based board. It has two PCI Express 16 speed slots. We're going to put in two graphics cards, so they only run at 8 times when you do that. There's a couple of reasons why I want to move it into this case. The first one is I just prefer the older cases. It was fun doing that retro sleeper kind of thing in a modern case, but you've got all sorts of things like, you know, USB 3 ports that you can't use and stuff like that. And of course, as mentioned before, not having an optical drive and a floppy drive is still a handicap even in the XP era. The other thing is, in the next video, I'm going to mod the hell out of this case. I'm going to chop it up and do stuff to it. When I actually bought it, I bought this case specifically for this project, and the guy actually took quite a low offer, and it's a nice solid case even though it's not branded. But I thought maybe I should use something a bit cheaper if I'm gonna like start hacking it up, but then I decided no, so I'm going to go ahead and do it with this one. And the processor we're going to be putting in is an Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600, which is a 2.4 gig thing that came out in 2007. So the parts we're using here are sort of right in the mid to late XP era. We've even got some funky OCZ SLI specific RAM, and this just had a bunch of extra bits and pieces. I think they freed up some space on the RAM that allowed them to put in stuff like automatic adjustments of timings and things like that. So you can't do it on the 650i chipset, but on the 680i I think it has all sorts of one-click memory overclocking and stuff like that. But yeah, that's what that's for. But I've only got it for the funky SLI sort of stickers, so they match the build. There was 2 gigs of RAM there. I've got another 2 coming, so I'll max out to the 4 that Windows XP 32-bit can address. I've got this is a modern-ish semi-modular power supply, 600 watts. This is out of one of my old gaming rigs, so should be more than enough for this build. It's nice as well because of the case mods I was talking about before. I want to try and keep this clear of cabling. Now, it's easy to do in the glass-sided case because it didn't have any optical drives or floppy drives, so there wasn't much clutter. I'm using an SSD here. It's tucked away down the side. It's 128 gig SSD, but with the modular PSU it means I can remove any cables that I don't really want flapping around the place. Also, drive wise, at least I can use SATA for the DVD drive, so that's going to be a small inconspicuous cable that won't cause any clutter. The floppy drive unfortunately would have to be a ribbon cable of some description. I do have like one of those sort of single core ones where all of the strands are rolled up into one, so you can keep that relatively clean. So MSI sticker on the front, I guess that was just from a motherboard that a previous owner had installed. I'll probably take that off and put something else in its place. And yeah, it's got one of these things, these front bezels that just sits on top of the bezel of the floppy drive, but that seems to be working okay and not getting caught, so that's cool. You can see there I've just clagged the SSD onto the inside of the bezel with some tape. And these are the graphics cards we're going to be using, so these are rather nice reference design NVIDIA 8800 GTs, which are pretty good performers. They were launched as mid-ranged cards, but really performed almost as well as some of the high range stuff. To begin with, I'm just using this. This is just a crappy cooler for LGA 775, because the plan here is, because this video is mostly about using thermoelectric cooling, I want to do a comparison with standard air cooling and see if the Peltier really is as good as they claim it should be on the box. And that's the build all together. Just a quick check to make sure that it boots and that it was working nicely with the two graphics cards. Got this rather filthy heatsink and fan. I don't know where it came from. For the test, I'm going to be using Prime 95. So we've got 4 workers running, 1 for each core, and then I'm just going to use hardware monitor to monitor the temperatures. I figured that running Prime 95 for an hour should be enough to get it up to heat, and then we'll just see what the temperature was at the beginning of the run and what the temperature was at the end, and then do the same for the Peltier, see what differences we get. So I started it at what was about 45 degrees. Well, the lowest one was 42, up to 45 was the range before firing off Prime 95. Come back an hour later and all the temps have climbed, so the range is what there, 55 to 58, so everything's kind of gone up between 10-12 degrees, which wasn't as much as I thought it would be, to be honest. Might have been something to do with having the side of the case off. So having done that, it's time to get the Peltier in. So you might have seen this box before, because on that video that I did where we had a choice of 4 things and had the poll, this was the last of those videos. It actually came in 3rd on the poll, but because I was waiting for the case, this is the 4th video. And yeah, it won some kind of award from a site I've never heard of, so take that with a pinch of salt. The box claims that it's going to keep your CPU at 28 degrees in typical applications. You can see from the diagrams we get like a front drive bay contraption, and then we've got the separate heatsink with a fan. The Peltier's wedged in there at the bottom above the cooling plate. On the back, lots of diagrams about the science. We'll have a closer look at that in a second with some slightly clearer diagrams perhaps. I had read that airflow can be an issue with this. I went ahead and took the old cooler off and put in some extra fans in this machine. I don't think it'll make any difference to this particular run because it's just reading directly from the CPU, but I put a fan in the front of the case and also put one of those little expansion slot coolers in as well, so just to get some extra sort of airflow in there, just ready for when I put it back together. In the meantime, I'll try and explain how these Peltiers work. So the principle is you get 2 dissimilar conductors. They call them a P-type and an N-type, and they're placed side by side with a space in between them. On the left there you've got what would be the plate that absorbs the heat, the cooling plate, so that would be copper or something like that. And then at the back there could be nothing, or there could be a heatsink and fan, and that's the thing that sucks the heat away, because the heat moves from the left on the cooling plate to the right on whatever heat extraction method you're using. You run a current in series through the P and the N semiconductors, and that creates a temperature. And this is a diagram of something a bit more like what we're dealing with on our actual cooler here. So here all of the pairs of semiconductors are arranged in like an array, like a grid, and on a plate, which is the cooling plate, which in this case is at the top. And then you can see where you've just got a couple of cables going in, positive and negative, and that just passes the current through in series through all of those pairs, and the gaps in between draw the heat away from the cooling plate and then emit it on the other side, where you suck it away with in our case a heat sink and a fan, and then the heat gets vented out of the case. Get the last fan in. one of the reasons why I'm doing this is I just read that if you're using a Peltier, one of the sort of things that you need to be aware of is because of the power draw that they have, you best off having a very well ventilated case if you can have one. Okay, we'll get the box open, see what we've got. Here we've got the Peltier unit itself. You can see there's a few extra cables on there. We'll take a closer look at that in a second, and how the Peltier is sandwiched in there. So basically it just looks like a normal heatsink and a fan. You've got the usual brackets. They're not actually attached to the heatsink the way they would be on a normal 775 contraption. These ones just, I guess, just kind of sit freely and push down on the edges of the plate. There is also a drive bay thingamajig. Instructions, who needs those? Look at that. That's like ancient museum quality thermal paste there. That probably wouldn't be very wise to use that. Who knows how long it's been in there. But yeah, this thing, I thought it was going to be a temperature display, but when I took a closer look and did actually look in the instructions, it's not. It's just a fan controller basically. There's a lot more going on in here, but that button just... Right, we can get the drive bay thing in first. Believe it or not, I actually thought this thing was beige. Somehow I had it in my head was beige. I should have really checked. When I bought this case, it was with the idea of this being beige, but it's not. So I'll have to do something else, maybe put a silver DVD or something in there to match it. And while I'm putting that in, I won't bore you with watching the details. You can see this is the unit, and you can see the little cells of semiconductor pairs sandwiched there between the top, which is the cold plate, and the back, which is where the heat gets sucked off. And then you can see the extra connectors we've got on here. So there's the fan goes into the power connector. It has its own power connector, which is like a 6-pin, bit like a graphics card one, that goes into the front panel selector. There is another little kind of odd cable, odd fan connector. I'm not quite sure what that's for. I don't know whether it plugs into the motherboard, just so the motherboard can still control the fan speed or something. I'm not sure. And then there's the cold plate on the front, which sits on. You can see the power connector a little bit better there. And there it is. It's all in. It just fits in like any other cooler, apart from the fact that there's a cable running off to the front panel, and we'll connect the USB front panel connectors in there as well. So we've got some extra USB ports to play with at the front, which is handy, as I don't have them on this case. And so all that's required now is just fire it up and give it a quick test to see if it works. There you go, the fan's buzzing, the front panel's glowing. What more could you want? All that remains to be done now is to fire up our test. So fire up Prime 95, get it running on its torture test again on all cores, and then fire up hardware monitor and get a starting point for the CPU temps. So on idle they look cooler, so it's kind of in the 30s. So it's like 34 to 37, which is better than the stock cooler that we used. And while it was running its test, I decided to replace that MSI sticker. So that's then replaced with a Hack the Planet sticker from Geek and Spiel and a SLI sticker that I had kicking around from ages ago. And then at the end of the hour the results came in, and I have to say this was not what I was expecting. The temps are just the same, identical. It started off cooler and idle, but when it was under load it still hit the 59, 57, 56, kind of the same, and I was expecting it to be cooler. So that got me thinking that maybe this thing wasn't working the way it was supposed to. Now, typical me, I just trusted that it would work out the box, and it doesn't appear to be. So what I've done here is I've fired it up using another PSU, so it's outside of the case. It's just running power into the front unit, which is then passing power on The fan does spin, though I've got it disconnected at the minute, and you know, I can feel nothing. There's no heat, there's no cold. This thing, it's like there's nothing happening. I got the multimeter out just to test voltage, basically to see if any voltage was getting through to the Peltier, and there was nothing. So the voltage gets through to this board happily enough, and it displays the stuff at the front. It powers the fan on the Peltier, which you've already seen. Now I suspect, because as I said before, this circuit here does some clever stuff to regulate the power consumption of the Peltier when it doesn't need to be going at its most full powered cooling effect when you don't need it. That I think from what I've read, this board tries to regulate it to keep it as close to that 28 degrees that it's mentioned on the box as its sort of gold standard temperature to reach. This board is supposed to manipulate the Peltier to try and keep it as close to that temperature as possible, and whatever circuitry is involved in that has gone wrong. You can see there's a couple of transistors on there, so there's some voltage regulation going on, and I suspect that that's probably where it's gone. So maybe one of those transistors has gone or something like that. Not sure. Don't know a huge amount about this kind of stuff, but I can probably stretch as far as testing the two transistors to make sure that they're still functioning as they should. In the meantime, the thing doesn't work, which was rather annoying, so that would be the end of this video. Then I did a bit of Googling to see if I could find out any information about it. I just came across a site. I think it was actually a Russian site. It was the only one I could find that actually gave you a spec. I was looking for a spec on the Peltier itself. I did have an idea about maybe powering it directly, and it seems from that site that this Peltier is rated at 12 volts max, I guess. So then suddenly I thought, well, if I can bypass the controller unit, it might not be working at its most efficient, but we might actually get some action out of the Peltier. So I took a Molex splitter and just stole a neutral and the 12 volts pin off it, and then ultimately we ended up with this rather handsome bodge job where I've literally just got the 12 volt and the neutral I just soldered the wire so it didn't sort of split apart, and shoved them straight into the relevant sockets to power the Peltier unit. The fan I disconnected from this and just plugged it straight into the motherboard, and when I powered it up, straight away it was sure as hell. You could feel the heat on the back plate, and the front plate got cold really quickly, and I thought, holy crap, that is like super cold. So at least this is something I can run the bench with. I've sort of given up on being able to put this together as planned and run it as the permanent cooler. I don't think that's going to happen right now, but yep, it's definitely working now, pumping 12 volts straight into it. Pretty chilly on the front. And I cursed myself and wished I had one of those little infrared temperature gauges you could get. That would have been perfect for pointing at the back and the front of that plate. But we've got something that we can power up with. I'm just going to put a bit of tape on to keep those things in place, because they are just literally shoved into the sockets on the power cable to the Peltier, and then we should be able to run our benchmark and see what happens. So powered up fine. One thing I noticed straight away, this thing is kicking off way more heat than the standard cooler was. So that hot plate at the back is really kicking off some extra ambient heat. And look at that, at idle, this thing is a fair bit cooler. If look at that, it's like 10.4, 10.4 at idle. That is massively cooler than the normal air cooler or this thing without its Peltier running. And then it was a case of loading up Prime 95 and firing up hardware monitor and walking away for an hour again. So I kept on checking on this thing because I was a bit worried about it, and it seemed to be doing all right. But then when I came back, it's just after an hour, it was literally the same again. It's possibly even hotter than the air cooler after running it on Prime 95 for an hour. So that was really rather disappointing. And I was in so much doubt that I actually got the thing out again, hooked it up to the external power supply and tested it again. And it is definitely working. It's hot on the back and cold on the front. So I don't know whether there's something extra would be going on with that front unit, but I can't see why. This thing is certainly much cooler at idle, so I'm guessing it works colder for sort of everyday applications, but when you really blast it, it doesn't seem to do any better than the normal cooler, which is thoroughly disappointing. Not what I expected to be at the end of this video. I was hoping to have a nice Peltier installed that performed brilliantly. So that is really rather disappointing. Well, I did kind of want to put that into this machine and run it as the cooler, though I have read that Peltiers are prone to fail catastrophically, which could potentially write your system off, but we've already proved that even without the Peltier running, this cooler is as good as, well, works as good as a standard cooler, basically, even if the Peltier is not running. And you think the Peltier would have added something, but it didn't seem to in our test. So, well, that can go back into its box, and it will be a display item only, I guess. I will test those transistors just to check that they're in spec. It would be great if it just turned out that one of those needed replacing, and then it will start functioning as it should, but I'll try that at a later date. But yeah, that's it. A bit of a disappointing end to quite a long process, and not the result I would have hoped for in this video. I was hoping to now put the box together and have that thing nicely Peltier cooled, and then that would be my XP gaming rig. Anyway, that didn't happen. So to end this video, I made a little clip of what it should have looked like. This is with it actually running without the Peltier operational, just using the heatsink. And the display, this is what it should have looked like. This is what it should have been like, all up and running. I got some silver bezels and everything to match the drive bay temperature gauge, which will now not be on the machine, so I'll have to go back to beige again. But this is what it should have been like, and it should have had a Peltier running, and it should have been running a lot cooler, but alas it wasn't. So a bit disappointing. It's a nice thing to have one of these things. I used to read about them in the magazines as one of the ultimate forms of cooling before water coolers became a common thing. But yeah, it is what it is. If you've made it this far in the video, sorry for the disappointment, but yeah, I hope you had fun watching me mess about with it anyway. So that's pretty much it for this one. I hope you'll join me on the next video where, as I said, we'll be modding the hell out of this case, also having to find a more reliable cooler and changing all of the drive bays back to beige. But yeah, it's all about case modding in the next one. I hope to see you then. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.
Sword's only rival in power. They were destined to meet on the field that will forever be known as the Plain of Tears. Zaramoth commanded control of the power, as Unai longed to disperse it. Both zealots could not win. But unbeknownst to either warrior, the sword and shield had destinies of their own. The sword shattered the shield and sparked the great cataclysm. The land split open, and the souls of the warriors, ripped from their chests, rushed into the river of souls that flowed beneath the land, splintering it into 1,000 blade irons. The shock